I'm Farai Chideya, host and creator of the podcast and nationally syndicated radio show, Our Body Politic. We center women of color in civic life and politics, and we are excited to partner with the 92nd Street Y for this special interview. You can find our show on your local public radio station, on Apple Podcast, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. In this week's episode, we also talked to Dr. Errol Southers, former FBI agent, counterterrorism expert, and professor at the University of Southern California. On January 6th, 2021, supporters of then-President Trump attacked the U.S. Capitol. They wanted to prevent Congress from certifying the 2020 election and Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States. 2 years later, the fallout from January 6th continues. Recently, the idea of a second American Civil War has entered the mainstream conversation. After the FBI raid on Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in August, Twitter references to Civil War jumped by 3,000%. My guest is Dr. Barbara F. Walter. She's the Rohr Chair of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and an expert on civil wars. Barbara first started studying civil wars in 1990. In 2017, she joined the Political Instability Task Force, a CIA advisory panel of experts who analyze data on conflict around the world to predict where political instability and conflict might happen next. She used all of that international experience to look at what's happening here in the U.S. in her New York Times best-selling book, How Civil Wars Start. Welcome, Barbara.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you very much.
So I want to start off with a question that I think some of our listeners might, find it hard to hear. When we think of the U.S. and of civil war, most people think of like armies and historical dress on a battlefield with bayonets. But that's not really what you're talking about. So what are you talking about in this book?
Yeah, I'm talking about the 21st century type of civil war, especially the type of ethnically based civil war that you see in countries with very powerful governments and powerful militaries. So the 21st century civil war is much more like an insurgency. It's decentralized. It's fought by multiple different militias, sometimes paramilitary organizations. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. And their primary mode of violence is guerrilla warfare and targeted terrorism against civilians. They're going to do everything they possibly can to avoid engaging American soldiers. And that's because they have no chance against a military like that.
There have been a wide variety of domestic terrorism incidents, from the planned kidnapping that was thwarted of Governor Gretchen Whitmer to, attacks on power facilities. Tell us what you think insurgency might look like, if we get closer to it or deeper into it.
So an insurgency would probably look something like this. It would start in an individual state. Michigan, for example, for reasons I don't entirely understand, has a long history of militias. It has more militias than most states in the country, and it has this very, very deep urban and rural divide. The vast majority of people who live in urban areas in Michigan are white. The vast majority of people who live in cities like Detroit are non-white. If you have a white supremacist group in Michigan, and there are, and they truly believe that the United States is a white Christian country, should continue to be a white Christian country, and the direction it's going in is wrong, they understand that they can't take control of the federal government, at least not yet. And so they're going to have more limited aims. If they could make Michigan a white ethno-state, that would be okay for many of them. And the way they would do that is they would start to target African-American churches in Detroit, or places where immigrants shop in Grand Rapids. And the goal there would be to intimidate that population into submission, to deter other non-whites from moving into Michigan, and to convince those that are already there to leave the state and find more sympathetic states. So here you could use targeted violence directed at these communities to really do a form of ethnic cleansing of the state.
Yeah, and you have a lot of international examples in your book. I want to get deeper into those later, but you talk about Sri Lanka, you talk about Al-Qaeda, you talk about Bosnia, you talk about the Zapatistas, many different types of movements coming from different ideological perspectives. But To circle back to what you were just saying about Michigan, throughout the book you talk about how in America factionalization tends to really break along racial and ethnic lines. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It actually also breaks along religious and this geographic line. And we call those types of factions super factions, and they're particularly dangerous. If you look at the Republican Party today, 25 years ago, if you were walking down the street and you saw a white American, you could flip a coin and you would be just about as correct that that person was a Democrat as a Republican. White Americans were split almost equally between those two parties. That's not the case today. Starting in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, the white working class, who had traditionally found their home in the Democratic Party. The Democrats tend to pursue economic policies that are more beneficial to the working class. But starting in 2008, the white working class gravitated towards the Republican Party. And they did this because the Republican Party was basically appealing to wedge issues, social issues, issues that resonated with that population. Today, the Republican Party is almost 80% white, and it's overwhelmingly evangelical Christian. And if you look again at those dramatic red, blue maps of the United States, it's clear that the rural areas of the United States are deep red and the urban areas tend to be deep blue. That's the definition of a super faction and the definition of an ethnic faction that our own government uses when it's thinking about who are the groups who could initiate political violence.
Yeah, and you talk about three big risk factors for a civil war. Anocracy, which is a term that I had never heard until this book, which shows that I got a lot to learn. Factionalism and downgrading. So what is anocracy, and are we one?
So anocracy is just a fancy term for a partial democracy. You could think about it as a weak democracy, an illiberal democracy. It's a government that has some features of democracy, but it also has some features of autocracy. Governments generally get into this middle zone if they're democratizing. So, for example, when Yugoslavia, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Yugoslavs were allowed to choose whatever government they wanted, they were gung-ho to form a democracy. They quickly instituted competitive elections. This catapulted them up the democratic scale into this middle zone. But you can also enter this dangerous middle anocracy zone from the other side if you are a one-strong democracy that's backsliding. So here you could think about what's been happening in Hungary, in Egypt, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in all sorts of countries around the world. The United States was for much of the past century has been considered a strong, healthy democracy.
How and when did things shift?
You know, by the measure that the task force uses, the U.S. was first downgraded in 2016. That was the year that international election monitors who come to the United States, just like they come to every other democracy around the world, they deemed the 2016 election free but not entirely fair. And they deemed it not entirely fair in part because our own intelligence agencies found that Russia had, in fact, meddled in that election, and because of the way we run elections here, which is somewhat undemocratic. Most healthy democracies do not allow their political parties to run election day, and that is what happens here. We were downgraded again in 2017 when the executive branch, the White House, refused to comply with requests by Congress for information, and when the president refused to comply with subpoenas. That might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is, because the main check on the power of the president is Congress. And if the president basically thumbs his nose at Congress, that suggests that you have a presidency that might be running amok. We were downgraded again by December of 2020 to an anocracy for the first time since 1800. And the reason we were downgraded was because we had a sitting president who was refusing to comply with the results of an election and was actively seeking to overturn those results. So we were an Anocracy at the end of 2020. We did have at least one of our political parties, which we would have considered an ethnic faction. This gave us two of the main predictors of political violence. If the CIA had been allowed to study the United States, which it absolutely is not allowed to do, the task force would have put the United States, or would have likely put the United States, on what we call the watch list, and we would have considered our country at risk of civil war. We have since improved our democracy rating and are now slightly higher. We're not where we were at our strongest point. And the reason we increased our rating was because we had a peaceful transfer of power. President Trump did agree to leave the White House, and we now have a new president and a new administration that is adhering to the rule of law. But the important point to make is that our institutions are no stronger today than they were in December of 2020. The Democrats have not been able to institute any reforms to strengthen our democracy. The only reason that we have been upgraded is because we have a particular individual in the White House who is honoring our institutions. But we are still very vulnerable to backsliding if somebody like Trump were to be elected again.
So we have also talked about factionalism already, but what is this idea of downgrading? I found this, that this has very much been a part of my political reporting on demographics and psychographics, but I didn't have that language for us. So tell us a little bit more.
So most people think that the groups that tend to start civil wars are the poorest groups in society, or the groups that are most heavily discriminated, or immigrants. And they think that for good reason. Those groups have real grievances against the status quo. They are not benefiting from the status quo, and they have a motive to try to change it, but they don't have the capacity to do so. They're oftentimes beleaguered. They don't have the ability to organize. Governments tend to be watching them quite closely. The groups that tend to start these types of wars are the groups that had been politically dominant but are in decline. So if you think about the Philippines, for example, the Philippines has had a decades-long civil war. It was started by a Muslim group in the southern Philippines in a region called Mindanao. They had been the majority population in Mindanao forever, and suddenly the government of the Philippines began to encourage Catholics from the north to settle there. And they gave Catholics inducements. They gave them the best land. They gave them the best jobs. And more Catholics moved into Mindanao, which had been sparsely populated. And so many of them moved down there that eventually Muslims in most of the regions in Mindanao became the minority. And as this was happening, they tried to protest. They talked to the government. They asked for a reprieve, and the government didn't do anything. And eventually extremists within that group began to organize a rebellion, and that rebellion continues today. So it was this sense of loss, of status, of political power, of cultural dominance. It was this resentment at the immigrants who were coming in and taking their land and taking their jobs. That motivates people more than anything else.
Yeah, and as someone who's covered politics literally the majority of my life and covered extremism for about half of my life, I definitely have, I remember one of my first key interviews with someone who was an organized white supremacist was with a white woman who was a member of the Klan. And she talked about how she had to live in a housing project with Black people. And of course, through my mind was running, lady, you don't have a race problem, you have a money problem. You can live in an all-white community if you have money, and it's not Black people's fault that you don't have money. I did not say that while we were talking, but it's this idea that she was robbed of her whiteness in a way by
robbed of her rightful status in society. Yes. She believes she deserves more than that. And the anger and resentment at that loss just seems to be particularly motivating. If you think back to January 6th, one of the striking visuals for me as I was watching it happen was to watch all of these white people, and they were predominantly men, all of these white men marching down towards down the mall towards the Capitol. They were taking videos of themselves. They were doing this with impunity. It didn't occur to them that they might actually be committing treason, because in their minds, they were patriots. America was their country. They had the right to take it back. They had the right to take it back by whatever means necessary. And that is something that the non-dominant populations do not feel. And I think that's the reason why you see groups like this eventually turning to violence, because they truly, truly believe that they deserve to rule, and that it is their right to do this.
Yeah, and you use another really interesting phrase, ethnic entrepreneur, and quoting you, you say that the biggest ethnic entrepreneur of all was President Trump, former President Trump. What do you mean by an ethnic entrepreneur?
Every society has people who are on the radical fringe. People who believe, who want a particular system that's more radical than what most citizens want. Here in this country, you could think of white supremacists that way. But radicals on the fringe have a real challenge. They're not going to be able to sustain their movement. They're certainly not going to be able to win their movement if they don't convince moderates, or at least some portion of the moderate population, to support them. And one of the things that happens is that they begin to craft a narrative of threat. People, when they feel threatened, tend to gravitate towards their own group, whether that's their religious group or their racial group or their ethnic group. They gravitate towards a place where they feel safe. And what often happens is that leaders of these radical movements, or leaders in the general population who want to take advantage of these moments, they play on this fear and this sense of threat. And they exaggerate it, and they emphasize identity over everything else. And they do this in order to get their support behind them. A really great example of this is what Slobodan Milosevic did in Yugoslavia as Yugoslavia was suddenly becoming a democracy. Slobodan Milosevic had been a hardcore communist during the communist era. Suddenly, that disappears. Yugoslavs want democratically elected politicians, and Milosevic wants to hold on to power. But he has a problem. He knows that Yugoslavs don't like communists, and he knows that Yugoslavs know that he's a communist. And so he has to figure out another way to appeal to him, and he becomes this classic ethnic entrepreneur. He realizes that he has this very clear advantage. The largest ethnic group in Yugoslavia are Serbs, and Slobodan Milosevic was a Serb. And so he very quickly took advantage of his access to state radio, state television, and he constantly bombarded Serbs with this message that Yugoslavia is going through this rapid transition. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of insecurity. People are going to be grabbing power. And he started to tell them that if they didn't band together and if they didn't elect a Serb, that the Croats were going to band together and they were going to elect a Croat. And if a Croat became president, they were going to kick the Serbs out of the military, kick them out of civil service jobs, and eventually start to kill them the way they had done in World War II. And this turned out to be a really, really effective message. Serbs who really didn't like Slobodan Milosevic suddenly began to support him because they came to believe that if they didn't, that they would be unprotected and they would be vulnerable. And of course, you see that here. There's this whole narrative about white genocide, this whole replacements theory. This has been perpetrated by ethnic entrepreneurs, that the white race in the United States is under threat. It is purposely being eliminated by the Democrats who are encouraging immigration and doing a whole series of other things. So ethnic entrepreneurs are these very savvy, often power-hungry individuals who can take a moment in time when people are feeling uncertain for a variety of reasons and begin to convince them that there's a real threat out there. The threat is an identity-based threat, and they have to band together if they're going to have any chance to survive. And of course, they're going to need to back and support this particular leader in order to do that.
Well, to me, among other things, and, the ironies of replacement theory, which, of course, is just this complete willful misreading and weaponization, is that the reason that, among many other things, that America is more racially diverse and less white is because of the one drop rule, which is that anyone who was one drop black was black. And so you have a bunch of light-skinned black people who in another country, and sometimes in other countries are considered white, So America created the rules, and now some people are manipulating the way that the rules of race were created as a construct, as a modern construct, in order to move populations. I just have to point things like that out because, to me, one of the many frustrating things and fascinating things is that so much of this is constructs. So much of this is how we have invented different rules about identity and then how they are manipulated. I mean, this is perhaps skipping ahead because I do want to continue with, the broader themes of the book. But how do you feel? Do you feel hopeful that we can grapple with some of these constructs?
I do feel hopeful, but that's in part because I tend to be an optimistic person, but it's also because I do think Americans, we're great problem solvers. We are very proactive. Most Americans deeply love this country and love what it stands for. Our founding motto was E pluribus unum. Out of many, we will become one. That is our founding motto. And I do think Americans want that ideal. So I'm optimistic also in part because, we have to be right. America is going to be the first white majority country that makes this great demographic transition to a truly multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial democracy. If we don't get this right, the rest of the world, I think, is going to follow that. We need to be a model for how you make this transition. And in the past year, I've worked with so many grassroots organizations. I've worked with so many Americans on the left and on the right who are dedicating their life to trying to strengthen our democracy, to trying to bring us together. And I just think with all of the talent and all of the possibility here in the United States, I do think we're going to be successful.
Let me actually trouble one of the main concepts in your book, which is democracy. Not only are we talking here in your book about American democracy, but again, you give so many international examples. America, to me, did not really become a full-fledged democracy until the Civil Rights era because so many Black people were forbidden, in fact, from voting. There was also the long era in which Black Americans were forbidden by law from voting, but then there was, another long era where people were prevented by the rule of the mob and exclusion. So was American democracy democracy? You also talk about Switzerland. I happened to take a fascinating trip, primarily with a group of American conservatives, to Switzerland with former Ambassador Faith Whittlesey, who's recently passed. And Switzerland is a nation which, you say in the book has become the longest, existing democracy in the world. But until 1971, women could not vote in Switzerland. And there was kind of a rogue canton where women did not get the right to vote until 1990. So can we even call these democracies before this point?
Yeah. So it's so interesting you bring up that case. My mother is from that rogue canton. She emigrated to the United States in 1958. She never wanted to go back to Switzerland. People would always ask her, how could you leave Switzerland? It's this idyllic place. And she's like, I never want to go back there. She wasn't allowed or my aunt was not allowed to vote till 1991, actually, when the federal government forced that canton to move. The Confederate South, prior to the Civil War, was not a democracy at all. During the Jim Crow era, there was massive voter suppression. We're moving in that direction today as well. American democracy, from the very inception of our democracy, has been plagued with not full participation, and that it has been highly discriminatory in a variety of ways. The interesting thing about this anocracy variable, though, that most people don't understand is that so democracy is measured in lots of different ways. You could use the Freedom House measure, which really talks about how much individual freedom there exists. Is there freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion? There's other measures that look very much at the franchise, whether everybody has the right to vote. The anocracy measure doesn't look at that. It looks at how strong the democratic institutions are. And in particular, it looks to see how many constraints there are on executive power. So, if you have a president in power, does that president really operate under a whole series of checks and balances so that he or she can't become an autocrat? So when the task force was looking at all of these different measures of democracy, and it was wondering, well, does it really matter if you exclude a whole portion of the population from voting? Does it matter if you don't have freedom of religion? All of these things. What turned up being important was not those things. It was, how strong are your democratic institutions? If you get a bully in the White House, will that bully be constrained? And the answer is, if you don't have strong constraints, that's when you get into trouble.
And I find that to be very, very clearly accurate in the way we're defining it. But, I think of Frederick Douglass, what to a slave is the 4th of July. What to someone who is disenfranchised within a democracy is democracy.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I worry about in the middle of the night, which I don't talk about that much. But, we know that full healthy democracies don't experience civil war. We also know that full autocracies rarely experience civil wars. All of the violence, or most of the violence, happens in the middle. So if you're in the anocracy zone, you can go in either direction. You can really do the hard work of reforming your institutions, making them stronger, getting yourself back into that safe, healthy, democratic place. Or you can go in the opposite direction, and you can consolidate power in the hands of the executive and become more and more autocratic. And I think one of the things that the Republican Party is doing right now, or at least large elements of the Republican Party are doing, is that they are desperately trying through various legal measures to greatly suppress the vote, especially for the Democratic Party. So they are essentially trying to continue to remain in power, even if they only get a minority of the votes. And they're doing this because eventually they want to hold on to power permanently. And Trump said this out loud when around January 6th, when he said, find me the votes to keep me in power. And once I'm in power, I'm not giving it up again. And so I think the voter suppression that you're seeing today is not only a way to systematically exclude portions of the American public, African Americans, Muslims, minorities, liberals, people who live in urban cities who don't vote Republican. It's not only a means to suppress that vote, but this is one of the early steps in creating a non-democratic America.
I was fascinated by something you write, and I'm quoting here. Civil wars rose alongside democracies. In 1870, almost no countries were experiencing civil war, but by 1992, there were over 50. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so this is this very counterintuitive pattern that we see, that if you're an autocracy, so let's say, what would be an example? Think about Iraq in 2003. In 2003, the United States went into Iraq. It toppled Saddam Hussein, threw out members of his government. It purged the military. And one of the things that the Bush administration claimed that they wanted to do was they wanted to bring democracy to Iraq. They put in a transition government. They then held elections. It had the trappings of a democracy. It was solidly in this middle zone. It was, in fact, an anocracy. And what happened in Iraq was, instead of getting this full, healthy democracy, which you almost never get off the bat, you got this very weak, rapidly changing government. Nobody really kind of knew who was in charge. Nobody knew how this was going to evolve. And bad people in society who wanted to grab power, they saw this as their opportunity to organize and to try to put themselves in government. And that's what happened during this long democratization phase that we saw for the 20th century, that as countries began to democratize, either because of the end of colonialism or the end of the Soviet era, or because people themselves were actually demanding reform, as these countries were democratizing, the old repressive regimes were breaking down. New leaders were coming into power. The governments, in some respects, many of them actually became weaker as they were trying to build democracy. And this weakness provided this really unique window of opportunity for those individuals in society who were shut out from power to try to grab it while they can. And so you do tend to see the rise of political violence as you see countries attempting to democratize. Of course, if they get to the other side of it, if they actually make it through this weak transitory middle zone and they begin to cement their institutions, citizens begin to get used to democracy. They begin to hold their leaders accountable. You begin to get a free press. The rule of law starts to take hold. Once that starts to happen, the risk of civil war drops precipitously.
So reframing this once again on the United States, thinking about the civil rights era as a moment where full democracy was provided in the United States to people of all races, as close as we've ever gotten, and looking at this, this period of just a few decades, why do you think, or do you think that we were solidly in the safe zone and then slipped out of it, or that we were never maybe as safe as we thought?
I think we're never as safe as we'd like to be, but we were pretty safe. The Voting Rights Act was powerful. It was enforced. It was effective. African Americans, began to have a real right to vote. They started to have real representation. That reversal under the Roberts Court has been really, really devastating, and you're starting to see the effects of that. The Republican Party, which is predominantly a white evangelical party today, understands that it does not have the votes to continue to compete effectively in a one-person, one-vote democracy. If it continues to appeal to its white base, that's the demographic here in the United States that is growing the slowest. They will be excluded from power in the system that we currently have, and so they have to try to go back to a version of the Jim Crow era where non-whites are actively excluded from voting, and they're doing it in a variety of really creative ways. And the Supreme Court is allowing them to do this without federal intervention here. We all know that there are lots of states in the United States that would be perfectly happy disproportionately giving political power to white Christians.
And you have groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. You have ideologies like the Three Percenters. I actually interviewed a former member of the military who was a Three Percenter during the 2016 election. These were groups that helped organize around the insurrection at the Capitol. And now you do have some prosecutions and some convictions, although far fewer than some people would like, thinking, some people think that the prosecutions have been too light. You have also, the Supreme Court shift, which we were just talking about. What are the important factors in whether or not we get through this era and back into a safe harbor of democracy?
Yeah. Well, we actually have an example from the past. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. At the time, he was portrayed as a lone wolf, kind of this crazy guy who did a crazy thing. The reality is he wasn't a lone wolf. He was probably part of the big Michigan militia. He had pages of the Turner Diaries in the backseat of his pickup truck. The Turner Diaries, even today, is still considered the Bible of the far right. It outlines a fictitious account of a civil war in the United States. It's essentially a playbook for how terrorist groups, small bands of insurgents, can take on the U.S. government and end up victorious. What happened after 1995 is the FBI aggressively went after far-right militias and far-right violent extremists here in the United States, and were actually quite effective. In 1996 was the peak of militias in the United States until recently. They then declined pretty consistently and precipitously after that, in part because the American public was so horrified by what happened in Oklahoma City, but in part because the FBI was effective at infiltrating these groups and bringing many of their leaders to justice. What many of us who study violent extremism today have been worried about until recently is the fact that the federal government and Democrats and Republicans have been turning a blind eye to this rising problem of domestic terrorism in the United States. In 2009, an individual at the Department of Homeland Security published a report about the disturbing increase in far-right extremism on chat rooms and online. This was published briefly and then was rescinded after the Republican Party had a huge outcry, and after the Obama administration decided it wasn't politically expedient to put that out there, in part because the report also highlighted the fact that these groups were recruiting from returning military soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan and from law enforcement. So for a very long time, those of us who study this have been watching this cancer grow and also watching the federal government really turn a blind eye to it. January 6th was actually, I think, a gift to the American public because it so clearly portrayed what was happening and it made it impossible to ignore any longer. So I actually think that after January 6th, it was a big wake-up call. I think the FBI is doing many of the same things that it did starting in 1995, and it will have an effect. Having said that, when I study the conditions under which political violence and civil war break out, these three conditions that you talked about at the very beginning of the show are still there. Our democracy has strengthened a bit, but not its institutions. Our institutions are still very, very vulnerable to backsliding. We still have parties that are deeply divided by race, by religion, by geography, and we still have a once dominant group that continues to be in decline.
So we're going to have to wrap up soon. I could talk to you all day, but I want to touch on social media. We've been, covering the evolution of Twitter and also just, social media platforms generally. And you say, in your book that social media is an ethnic entrepreneur's dream, and you call it an accelerant. What do you mean by accelerant?
So, people ask me what's the single easiest thing that the United States could do to reduce our risk of civil war. And my answer is always the same: regulate social media. We are increasingly seeing that the decline of democracy in the United States and all over the world, including most of the healthy liberal democracies that nobody thought would ever backslide, Sweden, the UK, we're starting to see that part of that is due to unregulated social media. An untold story that most people don't know about is that Vladimir Putin, since 2010, has had a very, very aggressive propaganda campaign in every single Western democracy, with the goal to undercut citizens' trust in their democracy, to bring into power far-right parties, and to weaken those democracies. He sees Western liberal democracies as the biggest threat to his own continued rule. Vladimir Putin could not attack the United States.
Can I just put a pin in, when we talk about liberal democracies, we're not talking about liberal conservative in the U.S. sense, are we?
No, we're not. We're talking about the most open, the most tolerant democracies.
Yeah. And so back to Putin.
If Putin wanted to somehow weaken France, Germany, the UK, the United States, he could not do this in any other way except the backdoor way through social media. And as long as social media is unregulated, he has easy access to try to divide these countries and to undercut support for democracy there. But we also know that the rise of ethnic factions, of hate crimes, of political violence have all tracked to the rise of not only the internet and social media as a main news source, but as it's tracked with the algorithms that the major tech companies have developed that select out the most incendiary, the most threatening material and pushes it to the widest audience. So when I talk about regulating social media, I don't talk about censoring it. I don't care what people put on social media. Let them put whatever they want on social media that will actually diffuse the criticisms by people like Mark Zuckerberg that this is a First Amendment issue. This is not a First Amendment issue.
Exactly.
Let people put whatever they want on social media, but don't allow the tech companies in an attempt to keep people engaged on their devices as long as possible, to push the most extreme material into people's hands. All of us, if I go on Facebook and I go through my feed, there's material on there that I did not seek out, that I did not ask for. It's coming into my feed. If I, like a photo of a policeman saving a kitten in a tree, I will increasingly get more and more material that pushes me towards, law and order parties and far right material. And that is something that we need to look very carefully at, because it's having real negative societal effects.
Yeah, and I would point to the New York Times audio series Rabbit Hole as a great narrative explanation of how these algorithms actually push people towards extremism, and it's not just passive, like, hey, I wanted to be an extremist. It's like, oh, we're gonna monetize extremism.
Exactly.
So, as we end here, what gives you joy and what gives you hope in a time where we have a lot of big things to think about?
Every time I just go out into the world and I talk to Americans, the first thing that you always see is their humanity. You see how similar we all are, and you see that we care about the same things. But I do think that we've become increasingly isolated from each other. We've become increasingly tied to our media feeds, which are not giving us a cross section of information that's tailoring the message to our most extreme thoughts, feelings, fears. And it's when you go out there and you actually just interact with people and talk to people that you realize that ultimately we all want the same thing. We just have to figure out how to get there.
Well, Professor Barbara Walter, thank you for sharing insights from your bestseller, How Civil Wars Start, with us today. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.